This is The Doorstep, sponsored by the Carnegie Council for Ethics in International Affairs, featuring Nikolas Gvosdev and Tatiana Serafin. This episode was recorded on January 8th, 2021.
Welcome. This is The Doorstep. I'm Tatiana Serafin, Senior Fellow at Carnegie Council.
Good morning. I'm Nick Gvosdev, also a Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Council and co-host of The Doorstep, and welcome to 2021.
What a week, Nick, it's been. We certainly, in our last episode of 2020, made some predictions for 2021, anticipating lots of changes in our administration and how that is going to connect the world to everyday concerns of our listeners and U.S. citizens and how we are going to get through 2021 in a new administration, in a new philosophy. And I don't think any of us, though, expected what happened this week, neither here in the U.S. or abroad. And so I'm wondering, as we look forward to the next couple of weeks and we take this day by day, what do you think the world is saying after what happened at the Capitol? We began looking at China and Russia in the early days of the Doorstep and how they were looking at our elections and anticipating potential changeover in power. But I don't think either of them really expected, do you, what happened this week?
I think everyone was taken by surprise by what happened. Normally, the certification of the Electoral College voting, which is done once the new Congress has been sworn in, is such a nondescript event that most people, I think, until this year, were really unaware of the process, and it really didn't have much of an impact. There was certainly in 2004 and in 2005, a little bit of issue regarding Ohio, and then of course there was protest in 2017. But the idea of the Capitol being essentially stormed by protesters, or as some people are calling them, insurrectionists, to try to force a change, in essence, to the election, which is to have the election overturned, or to at least send it back to the states or rerun it. This is a really consequential shift. I know that there are some people saying, well, this is just theater, and this past year has been a year of protests, but this really is one of those guardrail moments. We talk about guardrails that kind of keep a democratic system in check and keep it functioning, and this was a breach of those. And there's two connections really to the Doorstep as well that I think are very important as we move forward. And the first is a piece that appeared today in Foreign Policy by Emma Ashford, who looked at what happened on Tuesday and said, we need to really refocus how we do foreign policy, right? That the idea that the United States is going to be promoting all of this change overseas, while its domestic institutions are maybe a lot weaker and more hollowed out than we think they are. Perhaps this is she doesn't use the term doorstep, but it's implied that this is really, we have to come back and look at our own system. The other thing, and this comes into the mission of the Doorstep, which is what was really striking, reading some of the media accounts of people who were embedded with the protesters or insurrectionists or rioters or whatever term, and of course all of these terms are now being thrown out and used, is in the past we used to assume that we could have debates because we were all working off the same set of facts, that we might disagree about the interpretation of those facts, we might disagree about the implications, we might disagree about solutions, but we all were observing the same reality. And listening to, and reading and listening to some of the reporting coming out from what happened on the Capitol, from the people who were there, is they, and then the people inside the chamber and the people that disagree with them, we're no longer operating off of a single set of facts. We are operating, in essence, in different news and media realities. And in turn, that is also leading to a sense where people are moving away from, I want to have facts communicated to me, and this is what I feel, and what I feel becomes reality. And that has real implications for domestic policy, foreign policy, and the like. So I think that's something that, our mandate here at the Doorstep is to connect, international and global news to the doorstep, but it's also about ensuring that people have a sense of a slice of what's actually happening, and that we are operating off of that phrase. Finally, going back to your point about, what we opened the Doorstep with, looking at other major powers. We've been looking at Russia. We've been looking at China. One of the things Al Monitor, in their story on the reaction in Turkey, is quite instructive, in that their piece in the AI Monitor today, the Al Monitor today, was essentially the Schadenfreude in Turkey, of saying, America, you're not as your democracy is not as strong as you would like everyone to think. Your example perhaps is not one that should be followed. And indeed, there's a sense of now you're getting to experience a bit of what the United States in its foreign policy perhaps has been a little too cavalier in doing over the last couple of decades, which is you're seeing the results of what happens when you have, domestic foment. And let me just end on one last point, which I think, again, and this goes back to Emma Ashford's piece, which is I really hope that some of the policymakers moving forward will have a greater sense of humility. I opened one of my classes yesterday by saying every American who's chuckled, and I include myself as part of that. I've always chuckled over the last number of years watching some of the antics that occurred in the Rada in Ukraine, whether it was the smoke bombs or egging the speaker, fist fights, and between what happened, on the Capitol and what happened in the session of Congress yesterday, where we almost had fisticuffs. I think it's a reminder, as my colleague Andrew Mikta has liked to say, that we don't necessarily have the moral standing to lecture others about how they conduct their democracy or how they conduct their democratic procedures. So I would hope that particularly the new team coming in with the Biden administration maybe has a dose of humility about America's ability to lecture or to say, here's the model that we want you to follow. So sorry, a long mouthful of things, but I'm also interested, Tatiana, in your reactions and what you're hearing.
But you bring up a host of issues, and I guess I'll start off with the last point and then move through many of your points, because I do think they're all important. We've been talking about them all through the fall, and we'll continue this spring. I'm really excited with our lineup. But firstly and foremost is, what is America's role in the world, and what do we as U.S. citizens expect to be when we go out there, when we can finally travel, and how people are going to look and react to us is so important. And, I think, to your point, the Turkish papers, lots of the papers had lots of comments, many leaders in Europe coming out saying, we can't believe this is happening. Yes, in different words, even in all the European and Latin American papers using words from protest to mob violence to insurrection, but everybody expressing concern about the state of our democracy and our leadership role in the world. So, Chinese papers and diplomats, I saw a lot of tweets saying, wow, you lectured us about Hong Kong. Here, come give us, some advice when you're coming. And of course, many people pointing out that what happened in Hong Kong was protesters asking for legitimate elections, not insurrectionists, if you will, trying to overturn a legitimate election. But I do think that, China now, and we've talked about it through the fall, has taken strong positions in Latin America, in Africa, has a vaccine that Venezuela just tested that is super effective, that is expected to be given out in third world countries where Europe and the US have not stepped up, have been very insular in taking their vaccines. And so China really taking the lead and saying, haha, a little bit, I think, from what I'm reading, look at you lecturing us about our system and lecturing us about what's happening in Hong Kong. Well, who's having super raves in China right now? who's got the virus under control. And frankly, the citizens are letting this Chinese state control and surveillance take over a little bit. And I do want to mention, since we're talking about China, also, the fact that super billionaire Ma has disappeared from view from Alibaba right before he was supposed to take his Ant Group public because of comments he made. I mean, the Chinese really do have super control, and their economy is set to surpass the U.S. economy. I mean, I do think that, what has happened in the U.S. has put a dim light on our leadership in the world. And we talked about how China had taken that leadership role in the fall, and maybe 2021 is the year of China. So I want to lead with that and say the same comments were coming out of countries like Russia, like Venezuela, all saying, for Russia in particular, saying, haha, you said the same thing to us about Maidan. Now, of course, Ukraine is a totally separate country. Russia still thinks it belongs to them. Why they made the Maidan reference is beyond me, but they did. And so I do think we do enter 2021 in a weaker relative to these powers that are economically surpassing us, leadership-wise surpassing us, disinformation-wise surpassing us in the Russia's case. I don't know that with this power vacuum that's being created, all of these officials stepping down. And, as of this morning, I just saw 2 cabinet officials and a host of national security advisors and other advisors, press secretaries stepping down. But who knows what we'll see in the next coming weeks? Will we see a president impeached? Will we see, and this period of time really is creating, I think, instability also as the world looks at us like, why does our transfer of power take so long? In the UK, the next government steps in the next day. And this is really, I think this power vacuum is truly problematic and something we didn't anticipate in the fall when we were talking about all of these countries and their rise.
Well, that's a great point. You talk about the power vacuum, Tatiana. And again, this is, I think, a lot of people are really unaware or don't focus on, even in the best of times, the way that the U.S. structures its transitions is very chaotic. It leaves gaps. It leaves a whole host of issues. And with all of these Trump appointees stepping down, resigning, and you're saying, well, what does it matter? It's 13 days before the inauguration, except they're not there, so that when the Biden people start coming in, and as you said, Biden won't have a government fully staffed and ready to go on January 22nd. It's going to take months. And meanwhile, the caretakers from the Trump administration that would be expected to kind of continue that are leaving or stepping down. We're seeing these resignations in the National Security Council staff. Obviously, several cabinet secretaries step down, and that's sort of part of the normal process. But then those next levels of people exiting early leads to that degree of instability. There's a reason, I think, why the Europeans and the Chinese concluded their trade agreement and kind of wanted to wrap it up by December 30th. After taking several years to negotiate it. And there's that sense of locking it in. But again, I think also this idea too that, and this comes back to the coverage, is that it's not just simply, oh, this was a disturbing event, and some of the pictures obviously are really quite striking. Some of the people who were involved in the rush on the Capitol were certainly colorful characters, to say the least. But yeah, again, the longer term impacts, which then have doorstep implications. Now, interestingly enough, the currency markets sort of took this in stride. It was all right. This is an incident, but they're looking at questions of, with the Senate now likely, the Senate now being under Democratic control as well, are we going to see new stimulus pass? Are we going to see more economic assistance and the like? What will that do to consumption and helping people? But yeah, over time, these things again erode those invisible or not to the surface issues of, well, how can I, am I going to pay a higher rate on my mortgage? Am I going to be able to refinance my car? What's the ability of credit to be able, if I want to borrow to restart a business or get a business going again? All these things over time, if you have people looking and saying the United States is kind of absent, the United States looks a little more unstable, these are bit by bit things that happen, right? That Greek proverb of, bean by bean, the sack is filled. That as you keep having these little incidents and people say, well, what does it matter? Over time, they can become an issue, right? And then suddenly 5-10 years down the road, when people say, well, wait a minute, why are the interest rates so high? Well, we're borrowing a lot more, and other borrowers want to have a higher interest rate because they don't trust that the American currency is going to be worth as much as it is or was in the past, or things like that. So again, I think connecting this, why this matters, and part of, I think, the what we're trying to do with the Doorstep, but also I think what we're trying to, in our small way, to prod policymakers and politicians, is you need to make these things more explicit in your statements, in how you communicate with your constituents. That yes, there are consequences to when these things happen, and these are not just consequences that happen far away, that there are consequences that come back to you ultimately.
Although I think what you're saying is super interesting. I want to read you a quote from an analyst. Markets see the US government as ultimately a stable enough set of institutions, even if things go occasionally pear-shaped. Politics plays second fiddle to economic and corporate fundamentals when it comes to setting asset prices. The country's economic future coming out of the pandemic remains promising. Yesterday, today, markets open higher, not just in the US, but around the world. And so, it'll be really interesting to see as we go into 2021 and keep discussing the world and the impact here at home, that this idea that people are hopeful that the pandemic will be managed, that the vaccine rollout, though slow, is happening around the world. That even though Tokyo's locked down, UK's locked down, the vaccines are here and they are getting disseminated. And that even though we as policy wonks are completely paranoid about what happened this week in DC, over on Wall Street, there's optimism. And so I do want to make sure that we kind of balance those two issues. A lot of people saying because nobody went anywhere, there's a lot of savings around, and that once people can get back out there, we will rebound. So, although, we are a little doom and gloomy, I do want to kind of throw in that because the mark, and it's really, we're talking about Korea, Japan, the world indices are up. Elon Musk just beat Bezos as the world's richest person. So it's really interesting to see that this elevation is going up, although you can also counter it and say, well, wait a minute, is it also a disconnect between the haves and the have-nots? And I do think that is something that we do and have talked about at the Doorstep, that there is this element of people who aren't being uplifted either politically or economically. And this is why we're maybe seeing these protests and this insurrection, that there is this element, economic, racial, of people dissatisfied and unheard, both here in the US and around the world. We talked with Nahal Tusi in one episode about Europe's refugee crisis, and certainly there are a whole host of problems around the world with underserved citizens that I think that we need to look at as we go forward in 2021, because though it appears that the markets are saying we're positive, there are issues that I think that we need to look at, that we've spoken about at the Doorstep: food insecurity around the world, and other economic insecurity that you alluded to in the long term that might change once we realize how much it costs us to give those $2,000 stimulus checks.
Well, and I think that ties into something we tweeted out on the Doorstep podcast Twitter account a few days ago, the Andrew Mikta article about the pandemic really opening up these cleavages between haves and have-nots, between those that are prospering or have found a way to make the pandemic storm blow their windmill, and those that have, instead had that storm blow their house down. And how do governments respond? How do politics respond? Do people feel that the system in whatever country is responsive to their needs, and how does that play out? And then that comes back again to the importance of good information, which is that you need then to have a sense of, well, what's actually happening? Is it reliable? Is it been sourced correctly? Or is it skewed, or is it based on, well, this is what I feel to be true as opposed to what I've observed to be true? And so I think these are issues that are going to last beyond what happened this week. I do think that there is some element of irrational exuberance that somehow after the inauguration, a lot of things go back to quote unquote normal. We'll see. I think that the new administration and the new Congress is going to have a lot on their plates, and we'll see how they're able to cope with it.
Well, I do want to kind of end with your idea that facts are not always the same to people looking at them, and it's one of the issues I do want to look at as we go into our spring term. This idea that Judah Grunstein said in our last episode in 2020 of the splinter net, and how technology, cable shows have allowed us to have these alternate realities. But I think what we saw this week might be a changing of perception with Facebook and Zuckerberg locking out Trump from his Facebook and Instagram, Twitter locking Trump out for 12 hours at least initially, and kind of becoming more aggressive about their rules and regulations of how people communicate on their platforms. Now people are questioning cable companies and why they allow, right-wing media like OAN or Newsmax to produce the content they do. Will there be more regulation now with, the Democrats holding both houses and the presidency? Will there be more regulation on cable news companies, on tech companies? What will happen in 2021 is something we started to talk about, but it also has implications for our First Amendment rights and for free speech around the world. And I think 2021 is going to be a big year for this free speech movements and for our discussion of what is the responsibility of tech? What is the responsibility of media companies overall to this idea of free speech versus true information? And I think this is what's going to be really important as we go forward. Do you give platforms to rulers? And it's not just here in the US, it's around the world. What is and it goes back to how we started our discussion today. What is the US role around the world? Do we still have that moral authority to say, well, yes, free speech is important, yet, I'm going to lock you out of your Twitter account? I think these are really important issues that we're going to continue to talk about throughout this next cycle of the Doorstep, and really important issues to our listeners.
And you've talked about, using your students, your Gen Z students, really as the vanguard of this, which is how do they communicate? Where do they get information from? To what extent are these platforms private business entities that can regulate? To what extent are they now becoming utilities? We used to have doctrines about regulating the airwaves and public access and the responsibility of broadcast outlets to make sure that a wide variety of voices were represented. And are we going to see something similar here? But also, I think too, this idea of who regulates speech, who creates the guardrails of what is considered kind of acceptable. When does it tip over into incitement, riot, hatred, and therefore it becomes a danger? I think we're going to, again, have lots of these issues to be looking at. And I think coming back to the Gen Z question, which is, how are they going to be reacting, in a post-Trump era? really for Gen Z, Donald Trump is their first president. Second term, perhaps, of the Obama administration, they have some memory of, but really, this is the group that started to come to political maturity in the age of Donald Trump. And what will that mean? And we've seen some disturbing surveys that support for democracy drops the younger you go, support for free speech drops in younger cohorts. And what does that mean for an informed citizenry that is expecting to take part in politics? And will we see youth engagement continue? I know that you and Tom Nichols, who was our guest on the fourth Doorstep, kind of went back and forth on this, the level to which youth engagement is increasing or not increasing. We do have the question of the Biden administration at the top is boomer heavy, perhaps. But what will be happening, not just simply at the federal level, but at the local and state levels of new generations of people coming in? And again, where are they drawing their news? What are they seeing as the critical issues? And I think coming back to this last question of what role do they think America should be playing in the world?
I think we'll be looking at that throughout the course of this next few months. And we're starting out with Ash Jane from the Atlantic Council talking to us about new relationships and building new relationships, transatlantic relationships, which countries are going to kind of rise over the next few months as the US takes on a new president, and new leadership, new ideologies, new philosophies. I'm really excited to see how this pans out. And to talk with you, our listeners. Please visit us on our Twitter feed. Tell us what you think and what you want to hear from us over the next few months.
Thanks for listening to The Doorstep, sponsored by the Carnegie Council for Ethics in International Affairs. For more, go to carnegiecouncil.org. Stay healthy and safe.